Saint Ansbert of Rouen was a 7th century Frankish monastic and later bishop. He has occasionally come up in Catholic and Orthodox debates around a certain miracle which happens to many of the post-schism Catholic saints. These debates typically happen on X, so we naturally do not actually go into the life of Saint Ansbert himself. Today I'm going to explain the life of St. Ansbert as reported in the Vita Ansberti Episcopi, and also touch on the most remembered aspect of his saintly life. All sources will be listed in the description. St. Ansbert was born during the reign of Clotaire III in a state called Assisi, which resided in the district called Levison. Given that St. Ansbert was born in an estate, his father was a nobleman. Even as a boy, St. Ansbert was more concerned with the things of Christ than the things pertaining to his nobility. St. Ansbert's father, however, desired for him to follow in the footsteps of his forefathers by engaging in noble activities such as hunting. St. Ansbert's father also desired for him to marry the daughter of a ring bearer for the king, who was of a good bloodline, named Rotbertus. Rotbertus and St. Ansbert's father made a deal for St. Ansbert to marry the pure daughter of Rotbertus, Hagiography, on a fixed date. The blessed Hagiography desired to remain virgin for Christ, and so prayed that her beauty would turn into deformity, and the Lord granted her prayer straight away. Hagiography began to show the signs of leprosy, and so her father attempted to get doctors to cure her, but their attempts only made her more deformed. Rotbertus suspected this was the result of his daughter praying to end her life in virginity. And so after she confirmed this, all the parties involved agreed that it was best that she remained a virgin, with her eventually becoming a nun. However, St. Ansbert's father would continue to try to drag him into the affairs of nobility, making St. Ansbert become a court scribe due to his intelligence. St. Ansbert would excel in this profession naturally, but during this time as a scribe, he would also lead many to the path of eternal life. However, as can be expected, St. Ansbert left his life at the court behind with the guidance of the Lord. He came to the province of Rouen, where there was a monastery. Having joined it and submitting himself to its rule, St. Ansbert gained enough rapport through his holiness that he was allowed to meet the abbot. St. Ansbert humbled himself by prostrating before and adoring the waiting Christ in the abbot. He proclaimed his desire to be made a monk. St. Ansbert also renounced all the things of this world, in body and mind, and said that his hair should be cut in love of Christ. The abbot would make St. Ansbert a monk. It is at this point that St. Ansbert developed an intense love of reading the scriptures. And so, that saintly abbot, Saint-Wandrille, seeing the intelligence of St. Ansbert, decided to make available to him an abundance of books. And while reading one of these books, he came across a section from a holy father which said, "A monk lives in the monastery under one discipline of the Father, in the fellowship of many, so that he may learn humility from one and patience from another." This passage moved St. Ansbert to tears and filled him with a desire to live it out. First, having fully embraced the fundamentals of all virtues and humilities in his heart. Thus St. Ansbert submitted his neck to the yoke of Christ and his labor. In all the meetings of the monks, St. Ansbert was most humble. He was frequent in vigils, unceasing in prayers, had a zealous spirit, and because of this zealous spirit, St. Ansbert was prone to tears. St. Ansbert became the most pious of all the monks in that monastery. Saint-Wandrille began to appreciate the great zeal which was displayed in St. Ansbert. One day during a meeting of the monks, St. Ansbert requested of Saint-Wandrille that he be allowed to work with his hands outside the customary work of the brothers, that he may mortify his flesh. When these things were said, the other monks gave thanks to God, and the blessed abbot was granted this request. St. Ansbert was once working on some vines planted by St. Wandrille when the future king Theodoric the Young, while hunting, came upon him. Theodoric was fortified with holy benediction and instruction by St. Ansbert. As well as that, St. Ansbert would predict that Theodoric would become a king, which Theodoric at first rebuffed. However, when Theodoric became a king, he would attempt to have St. Ansbert made a bishop, which he denied, feeling as though he was unworthy. And when St. Wandrille passed on to eternal life, there was a new abbot named St. Lambert, who was also holy. St. Ansbert was loved by St. Lambert as if he were St. Lambert's son. However, that holy Lambert's time as abbot would come to an end, as the city of Lyon had elected him as their bishop. Though he protested, the command of the pious King Theodoric compelled him to take up that office, which he would govern humbly. And finally, the blessed Ansbert would be made rector of the monastery in which he had entered when it was governed under St. Wandrille. St. Ansbert would meditate on this great task which he was given by the flock, which he was now to govern and to feed spiritually. Wishing not to stumble in his position, but due to his great knowledge of Holy Writ, he was able to show his flock the path to holy life through his works and actions. And because of this holiness, St. Ansbert would be a light to his flock and to many more, hearing their confessions and strengthening their faith. In his time as abbot, St. Ansbert founded a hospital for the infirm, but St. Ansbert would not be long for his position as abbot. For when St. Audwin passed on to his eternal reward, the people of Rouen petitioned Theodoric, and with his permission, St. Ansbert was elected as their bishop. However, when the holy abbot Ansbert received the legates of the king, who wanted him to come to Paris. He rejected, as he did not know of his election to the bishopric and did not feel worthy of the office. But knowing that these legates summoning him to Paris could only mean he was elected to the episcopacy, he declined. Theodoric received this news from his legates. He devised a plan to get St. Ansbert to accept the office. Theodoric said he would accept St. Ansbert's wishes, but he must come to Paris to talk it over. When St. Ansbert got to Paris, he was taken into the palace by St. Lambert, the bishop of Lyon, and other bishops, where he was consecrated as bishop of the see of Rouen. And after this elevation, St. Ansbert began to shine with more works of holiness, taking particular care of widows, orphans, pilgrims, and guests. Throughout this time, St. Ansbert grew in holiness and decreased in wealth with his generous almsgiving. When hearing the clamoring of the needy masses outside seeking these alms, he said, "A man who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry and not be heard for giving out the alms." And so, at that time, when he celebrated Mass, a great multitude came together to participate in liturgy. St. Ansbert, having read the Holy Gospel, began to predict many things which were of different outcomes, with some being good or bad or to be feared. Since St. Ansbert was able to predict many things with the power of the Holy Spirit, the laity was set on fire with zealous passion, due penance, and good works. St. Ansbert did not forget his former monastery, having consecrated its priests when he became bishop. In the 682nd year since the Incarnation, St. Ansbert held a synod at Rouen with many other holy men and bishops, which proclaimed anathemas against shepherds who lived wicked lives. St. Ansbert also, during his pontificate, moved the body of St. Audouin to the church of St. Peter in the center of Rouen. However, the enemy of mankind convinced the Frankish prince Pepin that the holy bishop had plotted against him, so he was exiled. When St. Ansbert arrived at the place of his exile, monastery of Haute-Normandie, he was a light of holiness to them with his fasting and constant prayers. The devil was not satisfied with St. Ansbert simply being in exile, and so attempted to get Prince Pepin to execute the Bishop of Rouen. St. Ansbert, in response to this, sent the abbot of that monastery he was staying in and other holy men to that prince, perhaps make things simmer down. St. Ansbert casted down the office of bishop, that office that was forced upon him. That abbot Adolphus, with the help of God, was able to get Prince Pepin to show clemency. St. Ansbert's association with Saint-Wandrille helped in this regard, and so St. Ansbert thanked that holy abbot. St. Ansbert at this time knew that his time left on earth was short, and so wrote to the prince asking for his body to be kept in the monastery of Fontenelle, that place where he was first given into the rule of St. Benedict. And so, on February the 9th, celebrated Holy Mass, receiving the body and blood of the Lord, and making the sign of the cross over himself and all who were around him, he passed on to be with the Lord in paradise. The event in the Vita Ansberti, which perhaps most discussed when it comes to the life of St. Ansbert, is ironically what happened after his death. For context, St. Ansbert's body was to be moved to Fontenelle. When they opened his tomb, they thought that his venerable body would now stink after it had been buried for such a long time. However, the whole church was filled with such a most sweet, fragrant smell like the aroma of various flowers. Moreover, little drops of balsam flowed from the tomb. The brothers who had come from their own province to see him, and those he had kept with him in exile, wished to change his clothes and to dress him with new garments. Having taken off his clothes before he was put back in the tomb just as previously, they found the sign of the Lord's cross on his arms in a similar rosy color, so that all the faithful understood clearly that because he had carried the armor of Christ in his heart while he was living, marks of the cross were shown on his body in death. This specific section in the Vita has been a subject of controversy between Catholics and Orthodox when it comes to arguments about the validity of the Stigmata as a miracle from God. The first argument that I have seen against this incident as proof for a pre-schism Stigmata is the idea that it was not Christ's wounds, but rather the signs of crosses on his arm. I don't think this is quite right, as the word used here is the also famous Latin word stigmata, which in this context would refer to either a branding mark or a cut mark. I think the rosy color would also imply this is a bloody mark. There is also another rendering that I would like to go over. This comes from the article Signs of Salvation, Evolution of Stigmatic Spirituality before St. Francis of Assisi, which was published by Cambridge University on behalf of the American Society of Church History. It reads, "They found on his forearms the signs of the Levitical cross, bearing the likeness of the red color. It was evident to all the faithful that this was given to be understood that while he lived, he bore the arms of Christ in his heart. Therefore, Christ's stigmata were revealed on the body of the dead." This rendering makes a more explicit picture than that of the previous quotation. I'll put up the Latin of the passage in case anyone would like to take a look. However, something that I have as of yet not seen mentioned in this debate is Galatians 6:17, which reads, "From henceforth let no man be troublesome to me, for I bear the marks of the Lord Jesus in my body." No doubt the author of the Vita had this verse in mind when mentioning St. Ansbert's stigmata, since they both connect faithfulness to Christ with outward marks on the body. While I do concede that this verse is not speaking of the stigmata in the sense Catholics mean it in the modern era, I would rather contend that this verse is talking metaphysical wounds. For this interpretation, I appeal to St. Ignatius. In his letter to the Tarsians, he states, "So that our proper course is to live and partake of a life of pleasure, for that this is the chief good to beings who are in a little while to perish. And a swarm of such evils has burst in upon us. But ye have not given place by subjugation to them, no, not for 1 hour. For ye are the fellow citizens, as well as the disciples of Paul, who fully preach the gospel from Jerusalem round about unto Illyricum, and bear about the marks of Christ in his flesh." St. Peter of Alexandria of the Arian controversy writes in his canonical epistle, "But since the fourth Passover of the persecution has arrived, it is sufficient in the case of those who have been apprehended and thrown into prison, who have sustained torments not to be bore, and stripes intolerable, and many other dreadful afflictions, and afterwards have been betrayed by the fragility of the flesh, even though they were not at the first received on account of their grievous fall that followed. Yet because they contended sorely and resisted long, they did not come to this of their own will, but were betrayed by the fragility of their flesh. They show in their bodies the marks of Jesus." St. John Chrysostom makes several mentions of Galatians 6:17, but I will only use one for the sake of brevity. In his homilies on Ephesians, he says, "Nothing can be more blessed than that soul. In what does he glory? In bonds, in afflictions, in chains, in scars. I bear branded on my body, saith he, the marks of Jesus, as though they were some great trophy." Theodoret of Cyrus also alludes to Galatians 6:17. In his ecclesiastical history, he states, "Found the passion of the heretics still at boiling heat, and slain by them with stones, as was the blessed Stephen. Met with a sadder fate in their own than in a stranger's land. Others worn away with various cruelties, still bearing in their bodies the scars of their wounds and the marks of Christ." Now, to preempt the response I could see to these quotations, one could contend that if I concede that St. Paul's wounds were not the same as Christ, but rather scars from persecutions he suffered, could not the marks of St. Ansbert be non-stigmatic scars? I retort to this that if these are non-stigmatic wounds, in what way can they be said to be Christ? St. Paul's scars can be said to be of Christ because they were from the hardship brought on by preaching Christ, but St. Ansbert's marks would have no such connection since they are clearly post-mortem and miraculous in nature. The second objection is one which I think is more substantial. The second objection is that the Vita itself is centuries later than the life of St. Ansbert itself, making it an unreliable account. Before I get into the argument, the main source I'll be using for this section is the Hagiography of Saint-Wandrille by John Howe. Now let us begin discussing the historicity of the Vita Ansberti. The earliest manuscript of the Vita Ansberti comes from the 9th century, about 100 years after it was supposedly written. However, this is still earlier than some Eastern Orthodox name, and is of course pre-schism. To get into actual textual evidence, one point in favor of the Vita having an origin closer to the time of St. Ansbert is the fact that the transfer of St. Ansbert's remains from the Church of St. Paul to the Church of St. Peter is left unmentioned. The transfer to the Church of St. Peter happened in the early 8th century. A gratis being listed as the writer would also lend credence to a more contemporary origin of the account, since there is no famous gratis of this time to steal as the name of the writer of a Vita. However, I will now present the best evidence, in my opinion, against an early dating of the Vita. The disruption of the properties beyond the Rhone by the division between them would appear to place the composition of the Vita in the period around the time of the major Aquitanian revolt of the 8th century. As well as that, there appears to be some borrowing from late 8th century texts, such as the Liber Historiae Francorum, which at the earliest was composed in 726. However, a later dating of the Vita could not be any later than the early 9th century. This is because multiple early 9th century sources, such as the Vita Secunda of Aduanos and the Vita Secunda of Fontenelle, use it as a source. With all this in mind, I am of the opinion that the Vita Ansberti that we have today is for the most part the same as the original, with some minor alterations from other sources over the years, perhaps trying to add what they thought was context to events that they thought were happening at the time. I will also conclude this section by saying that while an atheist may have an easier time disregarding the Vita Ansberti, it should be troubling for any Eastern Orthodox that a saint that was widely venerated throughout supposedly Orthodox France has only one real source on his life that is hopelessly corrupted. To finish off, St. Ansbert is a saint that deserves more attention. His life is not often mentioned or discussed in detail. He serves as a light of sanctity in a hard and rough period like Merov in France, St. Ansbert of Rouen, or a pro nobis.